Yes, I am. I'm gonna take a look at these results quick as everyone else is doing right now, just to make sure I know my audience.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess can I just kind of walk over what's kind of striking to me? So 28% of you are only using organic and non-chemical weed control. About 5% use chemical herbicides regularly, 26 as site prep. 24 solely for invasive species, um, 6 using IPM and chemical, doesn't apply, 12, okay, timed. Yeah, this is all great. So this is perfect just for me to read quick before going to the presentation. So this is wonderful. I'm gonna go into the presentation now.
Look at all the hand weeding going on.
Yeah, we need to get you all into Washington County parks.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm gonna get from beginning. So again, Lori, Pollinator Friendly Alliance, thanks for having me here today. My name is Dan MacSwain. I'm a natural resource coordinator with Washington County Parks, and the title of today's presentation is Boots on the Ground Chemical-Free Park Management. And I'll be talking about ways that we've been doing this and moving towards that chemical-free goal in the park system. For those not familiar with Washington County Parks, we are located east of St. Paul, Minneapolis. Our easternmost border is the St. Croix River, and the Mississippi River is our southernmost border, just to orient everyone. In my role, I work primarily within the Parks Division, and I help with stewardship of our habitats and natural resources within these areas. And our park system consists of over 4,700 acres, 12 parks and trails throughout the length of the county. And we see over in 2019, we saw over 1.8 million visitors. This last year, it had been through the roof. I'm sure it was over 2 million plus. And people experience these natural resources via trails, our campgrounds, our pavilions, our swimming beaches, and our boat launches. So I think this is important so you understand why we're implementing these things, because we have a lot of public interaction. And when you have 1.9 million people visiting the parks, that's potentially 1.9 million questions about what's going on in the parks. And oftentimes staff will have to answer to that. So that's a little background for everyone. Here's an outline of what I'd like to cover. I want to go over the goal of the presentation just briefly to get everyone oriented on where we're going to go, because we're going to cover a lot of topics today. Talk about building the foundation, the approaches. I'm going to look at it from operations and maintenance to Prairie and Oak Savanna as the plant communities to focus on. And I think it's important to talk about operations and maintenance because it's often a large part of organizations' budgets. And that's probably an area where you can make a lot of change if you haven't done so in your community already. So the goal of what I'd like to cover today, I want to provide examples of techniques that are used to work towards a chemical-free goal in our regional park system, and this could be a city, state, national level as well. And here's the areas we'll talk about: operations and maintenance, high use areas, trails, and then we're going to talk about the natural resource stewardship in plant communities. Number one, when it comes to implementing change within any organization or in your community, and let's just talk about a city, county, state level, is be part of a local community organization. I can't stress this enough that oftentimes, even if you have one person on staff that think they have some good ideas, it takes a community and a group of individuals to say, hey, why aren't you trying to implement this? Without that support, ideas don't happen. So be part of a group such as PFA. And then meet with the staff and to discuss ideas for improvement. So a lot of people, they don't necessarily, some entities might not know that what they're doing can be improved. So just start with talking with them, get a dialogue going. And then once you've started that dialogue, set specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. If you don't do this at a government level, nothing will come to fruition and everyone will be disappointed with those goals. So for us at Washington County, Pollinator Friendly Alliance back in 2016, 2017, helped us pass a pollinator friendly resolution. And within that, we set specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. And that allowed us to continue to talk with our elected officials to say, yes, we're going to be doing this project, and it relates back to this policy that that came out. And then as part of that, I think it's very important for anyone to develop an integrated pest management plan. And even if it means you go through the process of just making one once, it's important because it gets you to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how. And so with that as our baseline, one of the opportunities that we saw to reduce chemical use in the parks was just as simple as finding out and prioritizing what turf there was across the park system, and just going one by one. Okay, is this turf here being used? And by used, I mean like, you know, high use next to swimming beaches, like families are picnicking. And sometimes it can be safety too, like as part of a view shed, people like to see more open areas, and that makes it more of a welcoming space to them. But you go through and you identify those areas, and then based on that, go through and say, hey, do we, you know, maybe the norm for this certain area is a little higher. So yeah, we want it to look really, really nice. So we may need to use a broadleaf control if possible. So, and I mentioned that, so the goal of this again is to work towards chemical-free park maintenance. And just by doing this simple step, you will eliminate a lot of foliar treatments across your city or county. So that's an idea for you to consider. Another idea to consider is just asking if your maintenance staff have gone to turf grass maintenance training. That's not always the case as far as training goes. So if you ask the question, then they'll say, yes, we can send our maintenance staff here to this training, here's the cost. And then you can also follow up and ask, okay, since you went to the turf grass maintenance training, how are you implementing those practices in the park? And often it's following the IPM approach. And I'm just wanted to mention that, and I know Ryan's going to be following up at 12 and talking about this more, but this is just a couple ideas for city, county level on how to move forward with chemical-free maintenance. Another idea, so you're going through and you're identifying your turf, and so this is a great example because this is at one of our parks called St. Croix Bluffs Regional Park, and we had a master plan, which is a planning document that guides where the park is to go in the future. And in that, the community was asking for a reduction in mowed turf areas. And, you know, Pollinator Friendly Alliance came in and they reinforced that, like, hey, is there a way you can take out turf grass, underutilized areas of turf grass in the park? And so we worked with Washington Conservation District with a local water quality improvement grant to convert these areas of mowed turf lawn into native prairie. And I think it's tough for me to follow Sarah, Chris, and Heather because you all have such wonderful pictures. And I find that I tend to do very quick pictures, and I don't always get to follow up to get like the really nice shots, but this is as best as I could do. On the left is an area that we were converting turf to prairie, and on the right is just 1-2 years later. And what's interesting about this is I was at another park and someone approached approached me, and we were down doing some weeding next to a shoreline, and they said, God, what you're doing at this one park is amazing. And we weren't even in that park, and they brought it up and asked about it. So you get a lot of public buy-in to that. And sometimes it can be hard with staff too, because you're changing the way you're doing things. But definitely think this is a great way to move forward with many cities and counties. High use areas. So back to that concept, this has probably been one of the most difficult areas to change the norms associated with them, especially around like campground posts, pads, stuff like that. And some of the ways that we've tried to eliminate herbicides in these areas is just using an organic burn down spray, which one being, I think it's product, I don't know if I can share products, but I think it's helpful for the audience to know. All Down is one of the ones we've tried where it's used over 65 degrees. And it's like a citrus oil that helps with the burn down. And that like provides that relief, and also allows for campers to stay on the pad and not go off to the turf, so they know that. We've also tried propane torching and grading. So those are some ideas to move forward with chemical-free options. Trails. So back to the intro, we have 1.9 million visitors visiting our regional park system, and many of them aren't there to see the infrastructure. A lot of it is they're there to see the natural resources, these habitats, the wildlife found throughout the parks. And one of the things that we found out when we sat down and looked at, okay, well, where are we using herbicide? One of the practices we did was we'd have staff, usually about 3 per day, go through the trail system and cut, treat, and chip that material. And in order to prevent them from having to go back and follow up the next year, they would use herbicide. So one of the ways we were able to cut that out in a majority of our system was by in the fall dormant season, when plants are dormant, going in with a track skid steer with a forestry mower head and lowering those shrubs and making it resprout again. Been very effective. We've saved so much time and money when it comes to our trail maintenance throughout the entire system. On the left, for one park, it could have taken them almost a month, 2 months to go through new trail maintenance. And now it takes a matter of maybe 3 days after the initial removal's been done. So this is a great option to consider if you have a trail system. So speaking of that, so what visitors come to see in our park system, we have grassland, forest, wetland, and lakes that people come to see. And this is a picture at one of our parks where it's a dry prairie remnant and then kind of oak savanna around it with a lake in the background. And so you're probably all thinking, well, how are you doing chemical-free management in these areas? These are at scale, like very large areas at scale. So to give that perspective, we have ungrazed prairie restorations, kind of dating back to the 1989, warm season grass dominated, and one park in just alone, we have over 400 acres of these. And then we also have these cool season dominated grassland that, either they were corn and soy or intensively grazed for many years and seeded to a non-native mixture. And we don't hay, we don't graze them, and there's no fire in them. And then we have these scattered dry prairie remnants that are also throughout the park system, and they're very small, 0.1 to 2 acre remnants. But I just wanted to set the scale of like kind of how we're thinking about this. And you're probably all thinking, and this is just my short list that I came up with today, is what are the weeds of concern next to our edges, our trails? So Canadian thistle, yes, we have it. Wild parsnip, tansy, Queen Anne's lace, sweet clover, knapweed, it's all there. But we are, for the most part, it's chemical free when it comes to these areas, but because we don't have staff time to go and eradicate all these species. We have to think about it more holistically, and what's there, why is it there, how far can that species spread. So getting back to what I talked about first in building that foundation, one of the most important things that you can do is create an IPM plan, and that sets the stage for how you think about species and where they are. It not only identify the plant, which everyone can now do these days. I don't know if you've noticed that, but iNaturalist and some of these plant apps, it's made everyone a botanist, and you know, especially when it comes to weeds. Oh, I found a weed. Okay, that's great. We know it's there, but there's a lot more to it than just knowing the plant and identifying it. But you need to monitor that plant. You have to assess the pest action thresholds. So yeah, maybe we have Canadian thistle in a prairie, but at what point do we need to take action where it's dramatically impacting the native plant communities around it? In a lot of cases, in some prairies, I don't think we need to, because it's really just filling these small niches, and obviously that changes by each prairie and each park too. So that's something to keep in mind. And then you go into, okay, now here are all of our options to control that plant species. So there's cultural, mechanical, physical, biological, chemical. And instead of just saying, oh, here's this plant, we're gonna go and we're gonna use herbicide to kill it. Like, that's not the approach. If you're working towards chemical-free parks management, you need to make sure that you're taking everything into consideration, which the IPM does. And one of the examples of this that I'd like to point out is Canadian thistle. And I know here's my only picture of a monarch in this presentation. And I know Wendy's going to talk about this a little bit later today at 1:30, but Canadian thistle still has value, and it has value to monarchs. And you know, there's two plants in particular that I've noticed in the park system where I see a lot of monarchs, and one being meadow blazing star, which I'm sure you all know. You'll see thousands of them if you have a dense planting. And then the second plant is Canadian thistle in the fall. That's probably the top two plants that I see monarchs feeding on. So it helps you recognize that value, that yeah, there's still that nectar resource for monarchs that the Canadian thistle is maybe providing in some of our less diverse areas. So to talk about the cultural, just to reinforce that, how does this apply? So when you think about it, it's like, okay, where is this weed and what is the plant community it is in and how diverse is it? Chris was talking about this a little bit in his presentation as far as like how edges can be weed sources, and you have different dynamics happening. So on the right here, we have a warm season grass dominated prairie restoration, big blue stem, very dominant. While on the left, we have the same prairie, which has been unburned, and there's actually a lot less, there's a few more noxious weeds per se on that left than it is on the right. And simply because we increased our plant competition, which the warm season grasses are fulfilling here. And so what I mean by that is, with cultural practices, how are you grazing? When are you grazing? When are you implementing fire? Another objective when it comes to that fire is, let's say we wanted to set back Kentucky bluegrass or smooth brome. Maybe we're gonna have a later spring burn when that Kentucky bluegrass is at 10, 12 inches to set it back. And maybe that's a way we can get rid of one of those noxious weeds. So thinking about it more holistically. And then the main one, when you think about cultural, if you do some research into IPM, it usually talks about plant selection. And I won't get into this too much because Karen's going to be following me with evaluating seed mix composition for pollinator habitat. But here's some of the things that I like to incorporate when it comes into ensuring that we're reducing chemical use and eliminating it from the park system. One is interseeding native plant species around edges of trails to increase species diversity. The more diverse you have your edges, the more resilient they are to species invasion. Very simple, and we can all do it. I think, based on some of the things that I've seen in the field, the importance is just getting that seed out there, and over a period of 10 years, eventually that seed comes up when the conditions are right. So get that seed out there. For the newer plantings and how we're trying to prevent these invasions is I'm trying to up the cool season grasses and sedges to a much higher density, because in our past plantings, our warm season grasses become dominant and they're not filling a specific niche. Their roots aren't covering every niche within the soil, so it allows for these other species to grab hold. And then, making sure that we have many different flowers throughout the season. And then cover crops, this is a separate presentation, but just how you use cover crops and when. Like, for example, here, this is a prairie on the left that was a expedited Conservation Partners Legacy grant, where we converted 48 acres worth of ag field into prairie. And I've had some mixed results with the use of cover crops. And in here, we just used it to hold the soil in more of a contour strip type planting. Here's this picture this last fall. You can kind of see in the light rows where the cover crop was used. And not only is it holding the soil, but it's also preventing some weeds from establishing as well, and being that nurse crop that Sarah was talking about. Okay, since you all do this, I don't need to talk about it too much, but hand pulling and digging, we do it, especially when it's a very small site and we're nervous about that species spreading, or it's very highly visible to the public with along a major roadway or a trail, and people, report it and think it's a concern. I know this is actually a musk thistle in here. It's not a native tall thistle. I know Sarah's probably thinking about that right now, but we implement these in high visibility areas for the most part, and in the other areas we'll let them be, and they do serve as a nectar resource for pollinators. And then with that, just making sure that we're overseeding is a practice too. Another practice that we do in implementing it is mechanical control. In a lot of cases, we can accomplish the plant and reducing its presence by just mowing it. And that's very easy for us to implement because we're mowing our park system trails anyways. And for us, we try to get in, and right as it's starting to bolt, and starting to flower, which is when that, I'm just going to use Canadian thistle for an example, even though you can do this for Queen Anne's lace or others, but just mowing it right when the root reserves are used up, and maybe doing it a couple times to make sure it doesn't go to flower and seed. And it's a lot easier to do things at scale than with herbicide when you're worrying about people using trails and having to shut them down. So that's why that's this method that we use quite frequently. And then another thing to think about when it comes to going to chemical free is biocontrols too. Maybe there's not a biocontrol now for a certain species, but is there in the future? And should you be putting resources towards managing something that maybe a biocontrol is eventually going to come in the future? So one of the examples, this is from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture website, but it's a spotted knapweed biocontrol. And I know they use it quite a bit in Wisconsin, UW Extension there. And not only seed head weevil, but the root boring weevil. And that's something that we'd like to potentially introduce at our parks too. So again, back to the concept of this talk, chemical free park management. And I know there's people in this audience that still use chemicals as part of their work. And you may say, you know, we don't have the time, the system, or the equipment to do all these other practices that I just talked about. And we think that if we don't do anything, it's going to harm whether it's that existing plant community or a new restoration. Well, if that's the case, try to minimize your use as much as possible. And this is an idea to consider. This is an employee using a foaming device where the foam's being applied with the herbicide directly to the plant. There's no immediate off-target exposure to the surrounding flowers in the area. So it's an idea to consider, and I just wanted to briefly touch on it. And then, so back to what's an idea. So we're thinking about, when we're thinking about our grasslands within our parks, and Chris was just talking about the importance of habitat heterogeneity. You know, there is value to cool season grasslands, but in a lot of our cool season grasslands, it lacks pollinator resources, and maybe it just contains Canadian thistle and spotted knapweed. So after hearing Sarah's talk a few, 3 years ago now, and reading the Xerces Organic Site Preparation Manual, which I believe is a resource online that people can take a look at, we decided that, okay, let's try to implement this in the parks where we have areas kind of located next to trails and campgrounds where it's really not great to be spraying. I mean, how would you like it to take vacation and then all of a sudden being exposed to herbicide via drift? Not fun, right? And you're going to call someone about it. Like, you know, I just took this time off. I came to enjoy nature and you're exposing me to herbicide. So back in 2019, so a couple years ago now, we went to an area that was formerly cropland, planted to Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and we used this soil inversion method to move forward. And we picked probably one of the wettest years. I would have said wettest years, but this last year was one of the wettest in the central portion of our county. And so we had a challenge of implementing the spring moldboard plow timing. But what we did, we ended up mowing, and then we moldboard plowed about 4 or 5 acres worth of ground within one of the parks. This is what it looked like after the moldboard plow on the left, so June 12th, 2019. And then on the right is what it looked like a few weeks later, which they recommend. So 2 to 3 weeks later, they recommend disking and then immediately planting. So June 12th and then July 8th hit. It's going really well, looking really good. You can see on that right-hand side that there's a little bit of cool season grass starting to resprout. And we're going into that dry period where, you know, the cool season grasses really aren't growing as much as the warm season grasses are. So that's, I think, what the timing was here. But we had an issue. The disc broke. So then we had to delay our timing and get it fixed. And so July 18th, so another couple weeks passed. You know, now we're really nervous. Like, is this really going to work? Are we too late in the year to plant? Well, we had already done the work, so let's move forward with it. So what we did, so this is on the left, is kind of what it was looking like before that day. So you can still see the cool season grasses in there starting to germinate. Hummocky as well. The rain really beat it down and helped minimize the disking. But to get to the planting stage on the right, that was about 4 passes with the disc and different angles across the field. And then that day or that night, we planted on like the hottest day of the year. And for the last 2 years, we've been mowing the prairie. And I just kind of went out there recently to check what the prairie was looking like, and it's doing great. It is way more diverse. There's way more vegetation structure. Are thistle and knapweed still present? Absolutely, they definitely are. But there's also black-eyed Susan, Monarda punctata, 4 or 5 different native grasses, and I'm pretty pleased with it so far. this upcoming year will be the first time that we don't mow, so it'll be interesting just to see how much natives come up, even amongst the cool season grasses that were there before. But as you can see, in the foreground, the native grasses, some of the native wildflowers, and then in the distance on that hillside, it's pretty bare, pretty open. It's just Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome. So if I'm looking at a habitat value, yeah, maybe there's still cool season grasses in here, but I think that's okay. It's providing different habitat for many different insects, birds, and wildlife. So we've been very pleased with it, and we're actually looking forward to some of the work that's upcoming here that local company called Stantec has been working on, and they're taking this to another level. So, noticing that thistle and the knapweed in these cool season grassland dominated areas, and our goal is to get more native plant communities. They took it one step further, and they're going to try to incorporate flame weeding to get rid of that weed bank in the soil, using cover crops, haying it, and then seeding and burning. So I put part 2 here because I'm looking forward to perhaps having them talk in 2024 to tell us all how that went, going chemical free. So the second part of the talk that I wanted to get into is just oak savanna. And I know this has been covered, like what we're doing in oak savanna areas. And throughout our park system, we have quite a bit of oak savanna. We have a lot of areas that were intensively grazed for years prior to it becoming a park. Then all of a sudden it all stopped at once. So I'm not just grazing, fire, people, everything stopped. Shrubs moved in. I think you all can relate to this. We also have factors, the atmospheric nitrogen deposition, high deer populations, which I know was a little bit of a debate on a couple of the presentations. I do think it has an impact, just especially when it comes to how small these plant communities are, and people aren't hunting them, wolves aren't there, and I can see it when it comes to browse and reproduction of some of the species within the park. And related to that, just Minnesota Native Plant Society has monthly talks, and one back in November, there was a Professor Waller from UW-Madison, I think it was Curtis Lab, that talked about some data related to deer densities and prevalence of plant species. So this is what's happening throughout our park system, and we're trying to restore these systems by removing that shrub layer. So I'll be talking about how we go about doing that in a chemical-free way. So before Pollinator Friendly Alliance approached us, and this is what we were doing when it came to these oak savanna areas. We initially removed the buckthorn, and we'd follow up spot spraying in the fall for the next 2 years, with that herbicide becoming less and less each time. But during this time, there'd be people that you'd meet on the trails, they were not happy. And then when you'd see an area where the residuals were still present, not only would you not be happy, but the public wouldn't be happy as well. So even though in the long run, we're creating good and trying to provide that opening for the native seed bank to come up, the public wasn't really on board with it. And that's why we've been trying to move towards chemical-free when it comes to this restoration work. So one of the ways, and I know Bree was talking about this earlier, but one of the ways that we've been trying to incorporate that is browsing with goats. And we're using goats to browse buckthorn, honeysuckle, Amur maple, and garlic mustard. We do that, so back to Chris's point on timing, goats do eat everything if you allow them to. But what we try to do when it comes to the goats is we allow, the spring ephemerals to bloom, up to June 15th, and then graze from June 15th to September 1st, and kind of getting that window where we're trying to use up all the root reserves. We have some sites where we're doing annual grazing, and then we've done one with double graze. And then we have a site down at Cottage Grove Ravine Regional Park, where we're targeting garlic mustard with the local watershed district named South Washington. And that's been very successful. I included some years behind each of them on what we're expecting. So in a lot of these sites, we're expecting to use the goats for potentially 3 to 4 years. This is what it looks like side by side. So on the left is an annual graze, and that's been grazed for 2 years, June 15th to September 1st being the timeline. And what's interesting about this one is no herbicide was ever used. And same on the right. So usually when we do the initial removal, herbicide is used as a basal bark treatment and or cut stump treatment. And we did not use that. Same on the right, a double graze. We did this past year at one of the parks, and we used the grazing in a way that the shrubs were going to be grazed at their weakest point. So in that July and August timeframe, with a 30-day rest in between to use up the root reserves as much as possible. And then from there, we did 2 different approaches that I'll talk about a little later. So you're probably all wondering, okay, wonderful. Yeah, goats are great, but we don't have the money to do it, or maybe you do. So this is how it works for us. We use seasonal staff to mow the line of where the paddock's going to be with the DR mower. And then we just have our staff complete the goat check once a day. And when you add in those costs from our end, we're looking at about like $60 to $80 per area being grazed, which is not very much at all. Like a goat check is very quick to complete. You're checking the fence, making sure it's up, counting goats, and you're off onto the other project. For us, we've been using a lot of units where we have 3 sides to it, and Lakeshore being one of them. And our cost is in that $350 to $450 per acre area on what we've been seeing as quotes. And then for a 2-time graze, which goes quicker on the second time, it's been about $300 per acre. And what's interesting about the goats, prior to PFA engaging with us, this was not something that was supported. And that when they came to us and say, hey, have you considered using something like goats? That provided the opportunity to say, hey, let's try this moving forward. And at one of the last first summits, I talked about that pilot study of how we were doing it at one park. And then that allowed it to grow. And eventually it's interesting that, now this upcoming year, our vehicle permit features a goat on it. So it's pretty exciting. So when it comes to goats, I like to talk about, it's always goats and something. Chris was talking about earlier about, fire and grazing. We can't you can't have one tool and just say, oh, yep, that is the solution. You need to have a lot of different management practices in your toolbox. And when it comes to the goats, goats with a crew following up, gathering and piling some of the dead wood, and allowing for a future control burn, because in our area, we can't have smoldering piles left overnight. So we need to try to reduce our cost. Thinning the mesic trees on site and providing those canopy gap openings. Seeding, we've been trying using seeding of a cover crop, oats, before. So after the buckthorn removal, before leaf out, and then after the goats are there. On the bottom left, there is a picture of Pollinator Friendly Alliance members seeding one of the project locations out at Lake Elmo Park Reserve. So that's a great fun activity to do in winter, right as the snow is starting to melt. And then cutting and dabbing or treating resprouts. Like if you're trying to reduce chemical use in your system, like think about how can you use that in the least amount possible. And then control burns, and then others as well. I know there's other products out there that people are considering. And actually one of the comments, thank you to someone who posted about the use of a certain paste up in Canada. Learned a little bit more about that yesterday after the conference, and maybe that's a solution or a tool that we can use in the future as well. Okay, so back to how does this actually look in each area? So on the picture on the left, we're 2 years in, and these are the things that we're looking at following up with. So we've been doing the thinning and fuel load reductions. We've seeded in the bare areas, and now we're at the point where we want to implement a control burn and then graze it again. And control burns being very important if you're undergoing oak savanna restoration. Maybe not as important when it comes to the prairie, in my opinion, because there's other ways around that. But in these oak savanna areas, especially if you're trying to go chemical free, it's something we should be trying to move towards. On the second one, how does it look? We have been doing the thinning and fuel load reductions, and then we had a company come in and mechanical graze this last fall. So they used that forestry mower to graze all the resprouts that the goats had. So really in all, this site got grazed or browsed 3 times throughout last year with no chemical being used. And then our follow-up, we're going to be doing some double cuts, mowing, and then continuing to seed and hopefully getting a burn implemented in 2024. When it comes to the goats, another important thing to think about is the positive public feedback. It's, in some respects, we have done a lot of restoration work prior to using goats, and it really didn't get noticed. You'd have some people say, hey, thanks, it's looking really good, but it's not like the goats. Like, you have people go out of their way to say, thank you for not using it on the trails. You don't have angry people. You maybe get one comment about, like, how are the goats grazing and don't they eat everything? And you have to talk about, okay, yeah, it's short term, but in the future, hopefully we're not using them as much, or we're using them at different times to mitigate impacts. And even this last year, people want to know about it. Like, we actually had to get to the point where staff were putting up a double fence, and they'd get stopped so much with questions, and it was the same questions over and over, that one of our seasonals, Amber, she said, hey, let's do some goat tours. And we were able to connect people to the goats, and they were able to learn about it and learn about them. And during that time, over 25% of the people, of the 75 people that came in, they had never been to the park before and didn't know how great of plant communities and habitats existed. So I think that's really important, especially with how cooped up we've all been. And they get to learn about the plant phenology, the plant communities, and the grazing methods being used. And then back to talking about the importance of, people, grazing, and fire, and how it's all interrelated into this system. One thing that helped too, or does help if you are implementing these practices that may seem more intense in the short term, is just putting out a board of what is happening and why. So this is like a 48-inch wide, I think it's 24 inches tall poster board that's out on the trail that gives everyone information about what's going on. And our local Washington Conservation District office staff helped with developing this. And this past winter, where we had over 45 acres being initially removed by one of the previous presenters, Minnesota Native Landscapes, we didn't get a single question yet. Could we in the next month or two? Definitely, especially with the snow melt, but I think these signage and just informing the public is very important as well. Okay, so a lot of you out there, you're like, okay, great, Dan, we can't graze. It's just not feasible. Okay, then mimic it. And most everyone has a mower, and maybe it's not a forestry mower, but maybe it's as small as a walk-behind mower. Mimic grazing, and here's the cost associated with it. When you're looking at walk-behind brush mower, for us, it's been anywhere between 120 to 180 per acre with staff time, and that's not contracted. And then for contracted with forestry mower on the left, that's 400 to 600 per acre is what we've been seeing. And I think that's really important just for the audience in case you're considering projects into the future, so you know how much that cost goes into it. And then back to a point I was talking about earlier, target the plants when the root reserves are being used up and you can set it back the most. So if you're thinking about buckthorn, that July, August, in my opinion, is a great time. And obviously that can be different depending on what plant species are there. And, mowing in an area where you have garlic mustard, for instance, in that July, August probably is not a good idea because you're going to be spreading it. And then another option too is you can be mowing in the winter and fall. All right, burn. So back to that concept of burning, and I know others have talked about it quite a bit. Often the term used is prescribed fire. At Washington County, I've been using a lot more of controlled burns, and that's partly because some of the work that has been done out of the Joint Science Fire program. That's different regions throughout the country that have fire science and the human dimensions of fire science, where they've studied that, hey, the use of controlled versus prescribed, it's more controlled is more accepted. And I've seen that on Facebook posts and just talking to people too, is a lot more people are at ease when you're using that controlled burn. But anyways, that's a side tangent. When it comes to the oak savanna and working towards that chemical free, thinning, fuel load reductions, and then trying to get that burn in at 3 to 5 years post burn, where you have enough oak leaf litter present to carry the fire. We've had great results when it comes to low humidity backing fires to really set back those shrubs and kill the top stem. I know some research out there and what people have seen, sometimes that just leads to resprouting. And other times it leads to a top kill, and I don't see it come back. And then I wasn't able to find the research, but there's some photo plot projects when it comes to fire science throughout the country, and you can see what if burning is your only tool, what type of frequency you need over like a 10-year period to get certain results. So whether it's 1, 2, or 3, and then you can kind of pick in between there. And for us, that 3 burns over a 10-year period would be ideal to open up the canopy a little bit, but not too much that we're getting public questions about what's happening.
Hey, Dan, this is going great. You've got some questions rolling in here.
So, yeah, and with that, I'll just wrap it up and just kind of say, what type of system are you interested in? And I'm looking forward to working in the future on trying to implement some of the conservation-based grazing. And I'm looking forward to hearing Sean's talk about conservation haying at 1240. And just quick acknowledgement to everyone out there that we've been working with. And if you're interested about learning more about the prairie and oak savanna in particular, check out the websites listed in organizations on the right. They have amazing resources out there and highly recommend it. Whether it's Chris's blog, Grassland Restoration Network, SARE, Prairie Enthusiasts, Tom's blog, Pleasant Valley Conservancy, he talks about buckthorn quite a bit. And then the Tallgrass Prairie Fire and Oak Savanna Fire Science page, as well as Xerces. So thank you.
And can you put that slide back up while we're talking for a little bit?
Oh, yep.
This question relates to land stewardship, as I like to call it, rather than management or control, because it gets us to start thinking about working with other sorts of non-toxic and more natural methods. But can you talk about how you think about thresholds and in what situations you might make the decision to just let something be rather than trying to control it, or maybe you mow it because there are no other effective ways of quote controlling it?
Yeah, so just to touch on that again, I think the best example for us, and it's the areas where we get the most amount of comment that, hey, you have a problem out here, why aren't you dealing with it? Um, I think about our cool season dominated grassland areas, so being Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and asking the question, because we're thinking at scale, like, okay, yeah, we could mow it, but are we really going to address the problem in the future? Because we can't follow up with it. Um, but like in a cool season grass area, maybe we're not going to control that species because we don't see it becoming a problem, whether it's because the Kentucky bluegrass is too dense and thick, or there's other weeds present in it that are kind of serving as a buffer. And by us taking action and let's just say using herbicide, what's going to fill in that niche after the herbicide? And and it depends on the plant species. In some, yes, you're going to have the grasses fill in, but in other cases, you're not. You're going to have this open area that allows for other species that may be as equally bad move in and create issues. So, and then that certain plant can change in a warm season grass dominated area or a prairie restoration. Like let's just say using thistle as an example, we may be taking action with that mechanical control next to a trail in a cool season grass dominated area because there's that complaint. But in the prairie restoration, even though it's still present there too, it may be less visible and impactful overall in that community because it's so diverse and there's very large pockets of diversity, and the Canadian thistle as a percentage of the whole is very small. So maybe that thistle is only 5-10% of the area. And that's just something that each person or organization needs to identify those action thresholds and when you're going to move forward, and know that populations and plants, their abundance changes throughout the season and depending on the conditions, the weather conditions and such.
Okay, well, you covered about 5 of the questions in that one answer, so I'm going to give you a pass.
Okay.
And I just wanted to comment for everyone out there that Dan has been instrumental. He's created a integrated pest management program for Washington County parks that has been actually implemented and followed, and it's become a model for other counties and park systems. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can contact us at Pollinator Friendly or Dan at Washington County Parks. And all of the email addresses are up on our summit website at pollinatorfriendly.org summit. So you can find our contact information there. I just typed it in the chat. So I think we've run out of time, and